Polymath, knife enthusiast, arborist, counselor, digital alchemist, Leonard is a modern-day Michelangelo of data. Listen to learn about his journey to being an AI engineer, how AI will impact the legal industry, and how to find success from your passions. Welcome to Do More, Be Better. Let's get into it. Leonard, welcome to Do More, Be Better, the podcast for entrepreneurs, founders, and professionals who want to improve and get better. Excited to talk to you today.
Thanks for having me.
So with all my guests, I always start with a little bit about my guest beyond what they do for a living. And so I always like to start with, what do you like to do when you're not benchmarking large language models or whatever it might be?
Well, I have to say that benchmarking large language models actually falls very nicely in the intersection of things that I like to do and things that I do professionally. So, I mean, what I was doing last night was benchmarking a large language model for fun. So that does take up a considerable amount of my time, but just to get further, far enough away from the world of legal and AI, I do enjoy gardening and tree horticulture. We've found some plants that grow really well in Northern California, and we've managed to keep them alive for a few years, so they bear fruit during the spring. So that's really fun. And then outside of that, I'm sort of a hobbyist in the area of knives, multi-tools, and metallurgy. So just kind of geeking out over different types of tools that fit in my pocket and do 20 different things.
Brings up a bunch of thoughts on a bunch of random things that I've been thinking about. And so I'm going to love to get into this. I will also say, I think what is interesting to me is, as I've talked to more and more professionals, founders who are a little bit older, who have gone through their journey a little bit, are still growing, obviously. The thread through all of them is the blend of personal life and work life is less about separation and more about just choosing what you're spending your time on. And so hearing you say, well, I actually kind of really like benchmarking large language models, is that okay? Is a perfect example of what I try to talk about on this podcast and generally is finding something that you really love, again, quote unquote, your passion or whatever it might be, and making it your life's work. If you can make it profitable, monetize it, that's how you're going to find real joy in life. And so I love to hear that about you. I think the classic question follow-up to that is, how did you figure out that you loved that data piece of not just AI, obviously, and benchmarking large language models, but really the passion behind that?
I think it was a gradual progression that really started at Lex Machina. So when I graduated from law school, I didn't really know what I wanted to do with this legal knowledge and sort of general technology background that I had. And in Lex Machina, I found this organization of like data nerds and legal nerds who would sit around and just sort of pontificate over the best ways to structure data, the best ways to get documents. Sits at the intersection of all these different facets of building technology and mining data and understanding the law in this new way, sort of computationally or analytically. And over time, I discovered that I was pretty good at it. So going all the way from legal concepts to data structures to finished data sets and figuring out all the interfaces in between. So it was really in that sort of building that company and building that product that I really fell in love with this intersection of law and data and what sometimes is referred to as legal informatics.
Let's take a step back then so our audience can understand a little bit of how you got into this. Where did you go to school? What did you go to school for? How did you get into this world?
Sure. Well, I started out like undergrad studying math and physics and chemistry. And at the time, I was actually also really interested in languages. So I had this totally crazy schedule where I would go to Japanese and then French and then German and then like spend my evenings, spend the afternoon in science labs. And then in the evenings, I had language labs. So I would be trying to figure out like what language I was supposed to be speaking and, doing chem lab experiments and physics experiments all throughout the afternoons. And so it's this really sort of intense, weird, disjoint liberal arts education that I didn't see anyone else sort of doing this, is what I should say, at least not at my school. And when I graduated from that, I went into sort of tech support and technology roles. I was doing quality assurance for video games and in the video encoder space. So like I worked at this small company that built video encoders and DVR software. And it was really interesting. It was at the time when the United States was switching to digital broadcast, ATSC standard for broadcast television. And so we were sort of capitalizing on that by selling little ATSC tuners and the software to use them with computers. So that was really fun for a few years. And after that, I went to law school. And I went to law school in part just because I was just really interested. Like when I became an adult, right? I became really interested in all of the contracts that people had to sign and agree to, and why they all kind of sucked. Like, why is this cell phone contract so bad? We all have one, and you can choose from about 3 different providers, and they're all pretty terrible. Like, why aren't there any good contracts, right? And so I think I still don't know the answer, but I went to law school because questions like that lingered in my mind. And I was also just really interested in, I had read this book by Besson and Murr about the economic performance of patents and sort of their conclusion that the median value of a patent, when you average out economic value minus discovery plus prosecution plus maintenance fees, is that most patents were of negative value. So you could sort of categorize them as sort of a failed concept of property. Like they don't achieve, they don't solve any problems as property because they actually have like negative value in aggregate. And then of course there's a very small number of patents that are like quite critical and really important, but you go and register 10,000 and 9,997 of them are worthless, or worse than worthless. So I studied IP at Santa Clara, which was an excellent school to do that. And when I graduated, it was actually through connections from Santa Clara that I got connected with Lex Machina, because several of the advisors from Santa Clara were at some of the advisors to Lex Machina were faculty at Lex Machina, and through some indirect chain of connections, I sort of got connected with that group and started working with them.
I found that while it's important to figure out what you're good at and then compound that knowledge to do well in a job or really anything, in the beginning, it actually is really helpful to have learned a whole bunch of different things that don't necessarily perfectly tie into each other. Again, you call it a liberal arts experience or curriculum, or just different jobs. I think I've worked 100 jobs to pay for things in my life, right? You just learn different things. And that experience set opens up your world so that you spot things that others don't, or you guide you down that journey to figure out what you really care about and passionate about, right? Do you think that in your experience and all those different things you did, that was really beneficial in your growth and career?
I sincerely hope so. I do see a lot of connections. So, just starting out with, like, I was really interested in science and mathematics, and that sort of just builds the general quantitative skills of sort of rigorously working through data and numbers and calculations and sort of understanding problem solving. Studying a lot of languages sort of gives me this kind of weird, so I don't know if it's weird, it's probably not weird. Maybe it's weird. Understanding of sort of language as just sort of these functional concepts that string together almost like programming language to accomplish a particular task. And in the law, we think of language sort of very much in the same way. It's like this functional instrument. Like these are our tools. How we write rules and regulations, how we determine whether a particular test is met. Like these are all just linguistic manifestations of language that we've sort of co-opted to serve as this tool to achieve some purpose. And then even with with LLMs and benchmarking and testing, like what I did in the video game space, I was working at Electronic Arts, is we developed what were called like smoke tests, which is basically just like this combination of performance tests to assure that a build is testable. And we had to sort of come up with different criterion to understand whether or not it was like working with the hardware correctly, working with the compliance requirements of the game platform correctly, and then functioning as the feature in the game is supposed to function. And so building out these smoke tests and like running them every single day, sort of, there's actually a pretty close analogy to that and building out things like benchmark sets, where you want to understand if your product is performing correctly with a large language model. And it's kind of funny because in the QA testing space, like I was doing what's referred to as black box testing, which is like a very non-technical form of testing. It's sort of like you're purposefully not supposed to not necessarily understand how the system works. It's just this thing where you put inputs in and then you get outputs and you measure them. And well, that's an LLM. Like I don't really know how it works. Well, some people know how they work, right? But I don't know precisely how they work. But I put things into it and I see what comes out, and that's what I'm measuring. Um, Having that comfort with working with a system where you don't fully understand how it works, but we need to measure it anyways. I think that background actually came from my QA experience. Like I draw a pretty direct connection to that work that I did.
Yeah, you didn't go to college to benchmark things, right? You learned it along the way in a different subset of experiences.
Yeah, I was in my 20s and I wanted to make video games. Like, there's a video game studio down the Redwood Shores. Let's go work on some games. Seemed like an awesome experience to me, and it was. It's great.
What made you want to go to law school? Was it the contract thing specifically, or was it more than that?
I would say part of it was ego, where I always thought of myself as the kind of person who would go to some form of graduate education, right? So I was like, oh well, clearly I'm going to go to grad school. I just need to figure out like which one. And so there was that sort of element. I guess sort of I felt like my education wasn't done. And then second was that contract thing and sort of the patent thing. Like I was just really interested in the way IP worked. I'd always been interested in technology. I thought the internet was awesome, but also just an interesting space in terms of like how it's regulated, how it behaves. I wanted to know more about that.
I want to ask you a couple things non AI related, and but I do think it brings us back to like kind of how you got here, right? Which is yes, you went to college, yes, you happen to have experience, but so do lots of other people, and we're in an age where there's a lot of discussion about what it means to work hard or to succeed. Does it require, Elon Musk 100-hour work weeks? Does it require giving up your own personal life? And so a question I had for you was a little bit of what does ambition mean to you? Like how did you feel like you got where you were? I'm sure part of it was working hard.
Yeah, I think at least for me, a big component of it was understanding there was it was important that there was an intersection between what I was good at, what I wanted to do, and what I could get paid to do. Like all three of them mattered. And it was really, I think, one of the most important sort of instructive points was like I was really good at like math and physics, science, but probably not good enough to get paid to do it. But I really liked it. I was pretty good at it, couldn't really get paid to do it. And then, so that was like an experience that sort of taught me something. And then when I went into video games is a sort of Elon style hardcore industry where, it's sort of legendary for its crunch periods where everyone is working like 60, 65, 70 hours. Like and I was hourly at the time. So we were kind of looking at, when we would go into time and a half versus double time for, going over what is double time over 12 hours. I don't remember. Like
Whatever it was, yeah.
we're working so many hours, we're spending so many hours in the office. And so you can work that hardcore and not make much money. Like the video game industry does not pay well, but it's like, it's everything you want to do. And it's so much fun. Like it almost felt to me like a trap because I loved doing it so much. I loved working in video games so much, but I realized that there was just no money and I would do nothing else because it was so many hours. So perhaps that would be, perhaps that calculus would work if I was making $500,000 a year, but I'm making 1/10 that, so just not tenable. So there's a lot of debate over whether you should pursue your passion, don't pursue your passion. All these different lessons. Scott Galloway, he says, don't pursue your passions, pursue what you can get paid for, become an expert at it, and then enjoy yourself later on. And that works really well if you can make sort of extraordinary amounts of money doing it. So I think that there was an element, I think there was a large element of luck and fortuity that this intersection of data science and AI and law was occurring at a time when I had spent some number of years like building systems that do just that using traditional NLP. So I don't know that there's any sort of advice in there or like suggestion, but I think that there was it was a confluence of all three elements for me.
As I listened to you, it seemed to me you had ambition to do great work and you were willing to work hard, especially on things you really enjoyed. But you also evaluated what success looked like for you. And for you, it wasn't going to be quote unquote successful to, yes, do that, but have no monetizing opportunity for your life. And so you kind of reevaluated. And so I've always viewed that ambition tied to some sort of success metric that allows you to live quote unquote your best world, your best life is valuable. And so, you know, I'm not sure I'm all the way on the Scott Galloway side of like just ignore your passion, because I do think when you find the thing that you love, everything feels easier. And if you can find that, that's good. I think what he's getting at is too much of the, I want to sit on a couch and watch movies and be a critic. And you're like, well, okay, that's great, but like, I don't know what that means. I also think one thing that I've always loved is Paul Graham, Y Combinator fame, has this set of essays, and one of them is how to do great work. And he also he talks about this idea, you kind of mentioned it there, which is sometimes you're looked at and you're doing something that everybody says is strange or weird, and you just keep doing it. And then all of a sudden that moment in time connects and everybody's like, oh, you're a genius. You knew this so long ago. And you're like, well, actually, it was just kind of the luck. I was just doing this thing and I gained an expertise in it. Right. And then obviously when you gain that expertise and that moment hits, hopefully you take advantage and you leverage it in some manner. Right. As people have asked me, how do you get to a successful, how do you get to do what you want to do? I always try to tell them is, I think a lot of what you just said, find something you really love doing. And if you can then find the intersection of that and monetizing it, you're going to be just fine. I think you talk to lawyers and they get bucketed kind of automatically, especially if people that have gone to law school longer ago, right? And you didn't have a lot of people that went in to be like software engineers that wanted law school, or, it was kind of, you went in because you wanted to give back, public good, you wanted to, whatever it might be, help the world, right? Which is an admirable thing to do. And as sort of corporate law progressed, you got more and more people who did business too, maybe got a law degree because they thought it would be helpful, those kinds of things. I love that we are starting to get into this world where the melding of software and law is kind of colliding in a very beneficial space. Do you think that your background or people with a background like you should consider law school more? Or is it a product of law schools just can't serve those people that well just because of how they're designed?
The funny thing is, with my understanding of law school, which is a 2009 to 2012 understanding of law school, my recommendation would be that if you do not intend to practice law, I do not recommend law school for you. Because if you go there to be sort of what I ended up doing was being a technologist and, somewhat interested in policy, but not practicing law. Like, I think that there is probably, at the time, there were more efficient paths to get to that point, I think, than actually going through full blown law school and sitting and passing the bar. Like, it's just so much effort compared to whether or not there's a more efficient pathway to get there. But what's really interesting is that law school has actually changed a lot since I went, only like 10 years ago, a little over 10 years ago, in that there are curricula that are more focused towards working with technology and like just innovations in law school curricula that didn't exist even just the 12, 13 years ago when I was there, which are really exciting and interesting. So I think that it might be more recommendable when I went than when I went. And if so, that's a really cool development. I wish that I had the resources of what they call the Tech Edge, JD Tech Edge program at Santa Clara University, which is kind of, funnily enough, when I looked at it, it was basically the course curricula that I chose for myself. Uh, and there was no sort of like formal version of that, whereas a combination of like IP and internet law and consumer protection and privacy. And I wasn't the only one doing it. Like, enough students were sort of interested in that combination of features that they built a program specifically that incorporated those areas of law and then combines it with like meaningful like externship programs and stuff, so that it bundles into like a cohesive program. I think there are more resources for that kind of for that kind of approach now. And then I also understand that like Stanford's curriculum is way more sort of technology, legal tech oriented, but it's kind of a special place that gets to do its own things. And I don't know how well. So I certainly couldn't get into Stanford, so I wouldn't know what that experience is like.
I'm with you. I think, if you've talked to me, I've gone through various levels of hatred of the legal system. I went to law school because I did want to try to figure out a way to do something that had a larger impact, right? Knowing what I know now about myself and about opportunities, I shouldn't have gone to law school. But you take that piece and you advance. And I think one of the things that I was always so frustrated with our legal system was this idea that only lawyers can possibly help in the legal system. And that has created this closed ecosystem and actually a monopoly of sorts, or a real monopoly of who's allowed to really participate. And that restriction in the ecosystem has left out so many smart people that just don't fit into that model. And it was so funny as I look back on it, how often professors, fellow students in law school were like, why are you here? You don't like fit this box. And then I got into being a lawyer and I got told I would constantly do there's this technology. We could use this technology. What about this? And they'd be like, Sal, just bill your hours, be a lawyer, be super smart, right? The classic thing when I started being a lawyer was this idea of your only job is to know the law, be really good at knowing the law, and everything else will work itself out. Such a crock of like classic, this is how I learned it, how it should be. And whether you believe in AGI or not, I think this current world we're in now is finally starting to push back on a lot of that and say, no, quite frankly, that hasn't served our country, our system of our legal system. And so there's another way to do that. And you're right, Stanford kind of gets to play by its own rules. There's like 3 or 4 of them. They get to do whatever the hell they want. And everybody else sort of follows along to some extent for some of the good things. So I think that's a great opportunity right now. If you are talking to people younger than us and they're trying to figure out what to do and they want to impact the legal system, where do you think they should start? I agree with you that I don't think law school is necessarily where they should start, but it's such a broad kind of industry. It's hard for me to always tell people, oh, you should focus on regulation. You should focus on contracts. You should, whatever it might be. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think if your end goal is to influence the legal industry itself, but the practice of law or the practice of law, then I think you really are looking at going to law school, because undergraduate work is not focused or specialized enough to really play in those spaces. But yeah, so that would be my recommendation. But to sort of touch on a point that you had brought up earlier about how, so much of law seems sort of regimented and siloed, and you're expected to sort of understand the law and churn out your billable hours. One thing that I think gets lost in that, and that leads to lawyers being resistant to change and being resistant to adopting technology, and it holds back access to justice and all these different things. Like, a part of that discussion that gets lost is that, like, the point of bureaucracy is to impose consistent outcomes. Like, when we have a system and we want it to be just, we want it to be fair, we want it to be predictable, like, you put in all these layers of extra steps and bureaucracy, and that's friction and it increases cost. But the purpose is that it's supposed to provide consistent outcomes of some kind. So, like, it's not always the case that all the regimentedness and like all of the resistance to change that lawyers have is simply rooted in like fear of the unknown. It's that we need consistent and good outcomes for our clients. Like, if my clients write on the facts and write on the law, they're supposed to win. So I need to be careful enough that I don't screw this up, that they actually get that outcome. Which is just something that I wanted to like to point out, because people look at large bureaucratic systems as only being, full of inefficiency, and like, they are probably full of inefficiency, but some of that inefficiency can serve a purpose.
It's an interesting point you make, because part of the regulatory makeup of the legal system is there to protect the so-called common person. And it's always frustrated me to no end, because the rules are consistent across no matter who I'm dealing with. So if I'm negotiating with the general counsel of Microsoft, my ethical guidelines are identical if I'm negotiating with somebody who has like a 5th grade education. It's like the same. And that never made any sense to me, because it doesn't work like that in literally any other industry, even highly regulated industry. if you are dealing with somebody who is highly sophisticated, they can understand what is going on. But if you're trying to protect everybody with one set of system, then that's just how it has to be. And I think it's also an interesting place because so many founders I talk to right now in the legal tech space are coming in. They're young, they're eager. They see an industry that is ripe for disruption. It finally has an influx of money, although I don't think quite as much money across the board as everybody perceives. I think there's a lot of money at the top, regardless. And they start hitting that regulation, and they start saying, "Oh, we're gonna replace all lawyers." I'm like, okay, sure, I've heard this before. And I think what's interesting to me is I'm so curious to see how our industry adjusts from this world of only lawyers can practice law and do this thing because of our ethical guidelines versus this influx of break it and I don't care, because that is Silicon Valley. Move fast and break it and see what happens and worry about it later. And can those two things coexist? What are your thoughts?
Well, so on the current amount of regulation that exists in the law, one can argue that it is too high because, in general, a lot of people can't afford attorneys. They can't afford lawyers for every dispute. People go and have to represent themselves pro se, and there are statistics about the number of people who go into court proceedings unrepresented, and at least some portion of them, I'm sure, would like to have an attorney on their side to answer questions and guide them through this process. So, like, we can look at that as a market failure to say the regulations are too high because there's this huge swath of underserved or this huge underserved population where if the costs were lower, they would benefit from representation. So I think that argues very strongly that we could be doing things better, faster, and cheaper. And with things like ABS rules that are being implemented in like sandboxes in Utah and Arizona, I think Minnesota is adding one too. We now have this sort of new structure where not only can we have ownership, but certain types of legal services that are performed by non-attorneys. So, which I think is really valuable because you go to the law firm and you go through all the different steps involved in representation, where it's intake and getting factual records and talking with clients. And like so many of these steps are already handled by non-attorneys. And then the attorney comes in and, applies a form template and looks up the 3 new cases that have resolved since the last time they did this matter, and then just plug in some values and then somebody else proofreads it. So the question is, like, can we get this process down to 0 attorneys and just turn it out, 10 times faster at half the cost? I don't know if that's possible, but there's certainly an opportunity there for some form of like alternative business structure along with automation to make certain types of routine transactions a lot cheaper. I think one of the spaces where there's innovation that's actually happening is in like wills and trusts, where creating things like a living trust or a will, and where a lot of this information can be sort of routinized. If you have all the information and you have all the laws, then you can sort of automate a script that will get you, 95% of the way there, and then have an attorney do the rest of it in 10% of the time. Like, that's a huge amount of innovation and cost savings. So I think there's a lot of opportunities there for sure. In terms of like this move fast and break thing sort of ethos, I hesitate to say that, that approach, when we talk about sort of disruption, the way that Silicon Valley likes to break things by sort of just pretending that regulations don't exist and operating in a space, even when, it's not even quasi-legal, it's actually just illegal. I don't know how that flies in the event that you actually you are sort of in a justice system facing position, right? Like if you have to go to court, if you have to file things, if you have to appear before a judge, then there are still rules to follow. And they're not going to look as kindly to, oh, I sent you an email. I didn't have to, I sent an email and I didn't have to file it in the court system. I did this other thing instead of, actually serving, the opposing party. Like, I don't think, like, none of that's going to work, right? So there are some limits that people are going to run into when they have to interface with the justice system if they don't do that in a more intelligent fashion.
There's a lot there to break out that I think is part of the running conversation that we're having. If you are in the sort of technology, modern lawyer space against the old guard of how it's always been, and then the influx of move fast and break things. And I think a key thing that, I talk a lot about is this access to justice idea. A lot of people look at it as almost zero sum. We have to protect our little space, because otherwise lawyers can't make enough money to live or all the rest of it. And it's interesting because the number is somewhere between 75 and 85%. Legal needs go unmet in the United States or Canada, similar numbers in Europe, right? And when you break that down, there are two sides to it. There's the true kind of what I would call end need consumer, which I view as access to justice. You know, your landlord tenant, your foreclosure, your criminal system, whatever it might be. And then there's the business need that people just didn't want to spend money on because lawyers charge too much, or crappy customer service because lawyers have generally been really bad at customer service. And I think it's important to break those two things apart, because on the true access to justice need, the thing I always say is, if you're a judge and you're frustrated with AI, current versions of tools, whatever it might be, how can it possibly be worse? And I always try to think about the positive. And if you're giving people tools and they're coming in and they tell you in an eloquent, thought out way that ChatGPT gave them or whatever, isn't that better? And if it's a hallucination and they don't know that, well, be the kind judge, lawyer that says, great attempt. I appreciate it. Thank you. That was made up. Can we focus again on a different thing? And how is that not better than a system where they just don't get to play? And it is inequitable in every version of the system. But I always try to put that to the side because I don't think that is I think it's a longer conversation of how you really address that. I think on the business side of stuff, for me at least, it's just so clear that the opportunity here is to give those people who are oftentimes very sophisticated, they run businesses, they do all the things, they just didn't have a legal need. And if you can give them a chat tool that gives them a contract that maybe isn't perfect, but they're happy with, great. If it gives them an answer on a regulatory thing that they can point themselves in a direction, so be it. And the reason I bring that up is I think, for me at least, the thing I've focused a lot on is we're coming to an age where domain expertise seems to be even more important than ever before, right? And instead of everybody knowing everything, it's actually going to be everybody knows a lot more than they did before. And then there's going to be a subset of few that really have that expertise. You brought up wills, contracts, whatever it might be. If you want a basic, great. Here, that's fantastic. That's part of the access to justice conversation or just the general need conversation. But if you really want that specific thing, you need a domain expert there. Question I have for you is, if I'm a domain expert now, a lawyer in this system, how do I start leveraging all the new technology so that I can maintain that domain expertise and still service clients in the same way I wanted?
If you love what you're hearing, click the follow button, the subscribe button, the bell, whatever it might be. It means so much to the podcast and to the guests we have on the show, and it makes such a difference. Thanks.
So I think in the near term, the kinds of leverage and advantages we're going to see from LLM technologies are going to be sort of like the efficiency gains, as opposed to this wholesale, like, replacing the lawyer entirely. As far as I've seen, like, the tools are not at a point where they actually replace domain expertise. So, really understanding what your workflow looks and really understanding where the tools are deficient and where they can be doing more, I think is part of understanding how to leverage technology better. There's this individual I've spoken with several times who I met over LinkedIn. I can't remember his name, but he was working on Social Security appeals. And so he had sort of developed over, I think, 15 years of practice, like this playbook of like how to get through like different types of like appeal rejections and denials. And so he has sort of built his own bespoke database of the rules, the regulations, the standards, like how the government will deny your claim, and then how you go to a Social Security judge in order to get that overturned because the law says X, Y, and Z. And he actually just understood that the economics of his practice area are such that like there aren't good legal tools, but the power of large language models is such that really if you just start, hacking these things together, like you can get a lot of efficiencies. And he actually built his own tool that combines his own built up practical knowledge over many years. And when you put in a benefits denial, it just starts giving you the legally correct sort of ways to get around those denials based upon like his own database of work product. So I think part of it is like, and this is a funny thing, is because I don't have this specific domain expertise. I didn't go out and practice for 10 years, but understanding where you can leverage the technology to solve a problem, where either the market's not met it or you understand the problem well enough. Like, I think that's really what matters. And there's kind of one interesting thing that you pointed out where you said sort of with more and more information, we kind of know more about more types of things. I actually kind of think that technology tends to move in the opposite direction where we know less about things. Like when HTML was new, like I could write a web page and I could put it together and post a picture of a pie or something. But now like websites are really complicated. There's like style sheets and CSS and React. Like I can't write one. And a long time ago, like when you bought a home router to connect up your network, like you'd connect it and you'd sort of like manage individual like DHCP leases and like assign IP addresses. Like you kind of knew how your network, you knew what your network topology looked like and you knew how it worked. And now like you just buy a router and you plug it in, it just does everything by itself. Like I don't know how it works. To change, like I want like per device access. It's like if I can't get to the admin page, like I don't know what to do next, because like, I used to just connect directly to all these devices, and now there's just layers and layers of software. It's like, it's really, really complex. So oftentimes I feel like with the proliferation of the systems we interact with, I just know less and less about each one of them individually.
You make an interesting point, because a lot of the things that people have argued about all the chatbots in the age of AI, Gen AI, is that it actually really helps people who don't know anything a lot right away, and then they plateau. And the people that already know a lot look at it, and this dumb bot doesn't know anything because they've already learned all that subset of stuff, right? And how we manage that so that the younger generation still learn and can be the domain experts that are necessary at the like top edge of whatever it might be. I don't think anybody knows the answer to that exactly, but it's an interesting point you make that we need domain expertise as much as ever, but as things get more complicated, it's more difficult to learn those things, right? And when, I remember talking, I think I probably posted on LinkedIn 2 years ago and 3 years ago almost now when ChatGPT came out, and everybody's complaining about, well, I can't use that thing until I perfectly understand how it works and all the rest of it. And I was, you drive a car around, it's a computer. You have no idea how your car works, and you're totally fine. So it's that trust factor and that nervousness of when do you cross that line of being comfortable with what it's doing. And I think what scares people about this current version of AI, because it is old, just this version of it has become much more real. And when you don't understand why something is doing, and even the smartest people in the world are a little bit, I don't know, we stuck some things into it and it started talking, that makes people really nervous. And so there's a huge trust delta right now, I think, in the usage of AI and what people are willing to accept. So one thing I wanted to do is take a little bit of a step back, was give people who don't really know what the heck we're talking about here a little bit of a primer. So some of the basics. What is a large language model?
What is a large language model?
Just at a highest level. I'm not asking you to be Ilya right now. I just like high level, like.
Yeah, so I think large language models are easier to understand when you look back in time at the earlier ones like GPT-2 and GPT-3, where it's basically a statistical model that's trained by ingesting and looking at all of just a very, very large corpus of language, like billions and trillions of documents. I don't think there's trillions of documents, but one internet's worth, and terabytes and terabytes of books. And just by looking at how the language is arranged everywhere, being able to predict the next token when it's given a sequence of tokens. So when you look at a model like GPT-2 or GPT-3, where it's looked at all the books and all the newspapers and all the websites, you give it a string of words, it just tries to find the next one. You say, there is a cat on the, and then it has to come up with the next word. The most probable word might be on the roof, on the bench. It just has to come up with the next word, and that's all it does. And then it continuously just predicts the next word and the next word and the next word. And statistically, based upon looking at what preceded it, what it thinks would most logically come afterwards. And then what really sort of gave rise to this ChatGPT moment is something called instruction tuning, where they trained, instead of simply producing the next token in a sequence, like you say, what is the capital of France? And GPT-2 would answer, what is the capital of Mexico? Because it thinks you're, a geography quiz, right? Instead of just trying to complete the sentence, complete the sequence, it actually interprets it as a task and then tries to complete it. So at that point, it says, what is the capital of France? Instead of giving you another question, it'll say Paris is the capital of France. And then it might say something like, what else can I help you with? Because they also told it to be helpful. And so and then these large language models at a very basic level, they just consist of these huge tables of like parameters, like a particular token, and then like all the different relationships it has to every other token and every other document. And somehow by putting it through this really complex set of linear algebra, it's able to take in a sequence, understand it as a task, or interpret it as having some form of directive, and then trying to complete that directive at your request. So at this point, if you've used something like GPT-4, it's really complex, really sophisticated. You can say, read this contract, tell me the effective date, tell me all the conditions under which, each party may terminate, and then put it in a bulleted list and speak like a pirate. And it'll just sort of do all these combination of tasks at one time. People sort of debate whether or not this is intelligence, whether it's sentient, whether it's all any of these things. And so that's where it gets kind of murky and academic.
The other thing I always like people to understand when they're getting into this is what you just spoke about has a finite cap, essentially. Whatever the model's been trained on, its corpus of data is what it knows. And so it stops and it doesn't have any more. And we've evolved beyond that, either through continuous training or people talk about retrieval augmented generation, RAG techniques, where you add documents in. And that's similar to what you said, right? Which is like you can add a contract into it and say, tell me the termination date. Tell me what any provisions on this that might be bad for my business or whatever it might be. If the large language model is just a predictive tool, it's just predicting the next likeliest word, sentence, whatever it might be, how is it that the model can make that evaluation? Look at this contract, this specific contract, and tell me the date of termination. How does it do that if it's just predicting the next token?
Well, part of what happened with the Google DeepMind paper, attention is all you need, which I haven't read, but my understanding is that the implication of that research was that these models could make predictions over much, much longer token sequence lengths. Previous models, their accuracy and usefulness would drop off after producing their 15 words. Like they might predict one sentence, but then the next sentence would be complete nonsense and so on and so forth. But through some miraculous aspect of the new transformer architecture, attention-based transformers, is that they can pay attention to much, much longer sequences, producing entirely coherent paragraphs and pages of information. And then also through some other technology that I'm not quite as familiar with, like the context windows got extremely large to where instead of previous versions of large language models, GPT-3 could only look at probably 5 or 6 pages of information at once. And now we have these models that can look at 200,000 tokens at the same time, which is something like, 120 pages of text. So now we can fit entire contracts in there, pull out information, manipulate it, and format it, and do all kinds of interesting automation things with them.
Yeah, and what I always try to explain to people is there's a software layer on top of the other, whether sentient being or whatever you want to call it, and it's instructing, directing guidelines. So instead of just predict anything, it's, hey, if you don't know the answer, you have to look here. If you don't have it in your data set, you have to look here. And then you can only answer in this set. Doesn't mean it eliminates all this kind of idea of hallucination, but it helps guide, instruct the model on where to go. And because if it's looked at a corpus of hundreds of thousands of millions of contracts and you ask it, is this a good provision, a bad provision, good for me, bad for me, whatever, it can make an analysis, right? A prediction of sorts across that huge data set. One other question I get asked a lot is, all right, so I want to get into this. Why do I have to understand whether I use Claude or ChatGPT or Gemini or a chatbot versus, some other system? And one question I have for you is, if I'm a lawyer in a law firm, or let's say I'm a managing partner in a law firm and I'm trying to get on board with this? How do I go about it? Do I give all my lawyers a chatbot? Do I hire a developer to leverage an API? How would you suggest I go about it?
Well, the first thing I would do is talk with your IT and information security team, because figuring out who's using what tools where and for what purposes is kind of critical here. A lot of these tools, the sort of consumer versions of them, don't have the highest levels of data security and privacy built into them. In fact, there's not exactly like social media companies, but as sort of like a data collection tool. So as people use the free versions of ChatGPT and Anthropic Claude, that generates sort of usage data and certain kinds of log data that the companies will retain and use to improve their products. And so for anything where there's confidentiality or security involved, my recommendation is not to use a tool that doesn't have sort of commercial or enterprise level of security stapled onto them. Because lawyers are doing things that are critical and sensitive and confidential, you wouldn't want to be just putting confidential information into any given system. There's a security aspect to be aware of first. But the second is that if you wanted to start exploring them, you would start with information that's non-critical, right? So information where you maybe give it a court opinion that you're already familiar with, and upload the document. That's a public document. There's no security issues with that. And then ask you questions that you already know the answers to. Things like, what test did the court apply? Who won on summary judgment? Did the court issue summary judgment? And then start to evaluate whether or not the results look useful and accurate to you. One of the things I've been looking at recently is, well, it's kind of a much longer, weird discussion, but I've been building this sort of evaluation platform to try to figure out, just to look at a document and compare one document to another in a way that sort of quantifies retention of semantic information after summarization. And a lot of that just involves breaking down a document into like 100 different questions and then going back and seeing if the LLM even evaluates them accurately. There are lots of different weird situations where large language models can get the wrong impression from a document. They can sometimes it's referred to as hallucinate or just produce information that wouldn't conform with an expert's perception and opinion of that document. So understanding how large language models look at a document and process it just through sort of observation is a really powerful way to get more familiar with them.
Do you think organizations, law firms, whomever, when they're really trying to wrap their arms around these tools and start to leverage them, should go back to kind of what I felt like was the critical thing you were supposed to be doing 5-6 years ago, which is, clean your data, make sure you have as much structured data as you can, and metadata tagging and all the rest of it? Or because we have this age of large language models, it just isn't necessary anymore?
Well, there's sort of two answers to this. One is that part of the miracle and promise of large language models was that now we can work with unstructured data. Like you can put any kind of text source in there and it will parse it out and it'll find the good stuff and it will give you the answers. But it's still very much the case that data quality is important. And the higher quality information, the more precise information that you can give to a large language model with useful context around that information, the better they perform. So if you wanted to review a contract clause, let's put like a hypothetical where, let's say we're doing playbook analysis where we have preferred terms and we have an agreement. And we want to know if this agreement meets the standards required by our organization based on some playbook. Well, the playbook itself is probably not enough context for the large language model to understand if the contract it's evaluating meets those criteria or not. So now you need an extra set of rules around the playbook to explain, what does it mean? What are market rate terms? What does that term mean? What does client favorable mean in this circumstance? What is, this set of terms or conditions or better? What's considered better? How is favorability determined? The large language model on its own is simply going to draw on having looked at 50 million contracts and sort of making up what it thinks better consists of, and it will give you an answer whether or not it aligns with your expectations. So data quality is still very important if you're sort of building your own application and working, from start with the API on your project. But the other way to look at this is to say that there are lots of these companies, these legal tech companies, who are building platforms that can do document ingestion and labeling and do that in a really precise manner and also securely. Like that's the other advantage of going with, a co-counsel or a Harvey, is that they have the data security that's required to do things responsibly. And at that point, it's figuring out whatever the platform needs to properly ingest data. Like maybe maybe it integrates with iManage, so you don't have to do a whole lot of labeling to get like really good quality like ingested data to use with your large language model product. So at that point, it sort of depends.
I think this idea of data, it always comes back to data, is something that people want to get away from because it is kind of time intensive and requires a lot of work and oftentimes a lot of money. And so it's always been this promise of, oh, we don't need that anymore. And then we come back and you're like, actually, yeah, we still need that. Okay, so let's try again. I do think in this space, especially in legal, as we talk about, this idea of document ingestion, tagging, metadata, categorization, cleaning that data is almost a perfect fit for these eDiscovery vendors, these vendors that have created these platforms to leverage really in the beginning litigation, right? Looking at all the different things you need in a document and finding the needle in a haystack or just the documents you might need. What are your thoughts about where eDiscovery vendors play in this kind of new ecosystem?
So I agree with your assessment. I think that they're really, really well positioned because before the large language model revolution, they were leveraging machine learning and NLP and building secure data rooms in order to ingest what was oftentimes like semi-structured or unstructured data of arbitrary kinds to further like litigation and e-discovery. So it might be a bunch of project documents, a bunch of internal work documents. It might be tweets and instant messages, or more typically something like a whole bunch of emails. And so they receive all this information that is, it might be like pictures of emails, it might be, pictures of instant messages, and they have to ingest it, categorize it, OCR it, label it, and then make it accessible and secure. That's like the perfect initial step to building out this large corpus of information that can then be fed into some kind of like LLM application to do further processing and do other types of intelligent applications. There's a fellow named, I think, John Trednick on LinkedIn, and he has like Merlin Systems, Merlin eDiscovery, and he has posted a lot of great articles about how they integrate their data ingestion systems with some kind of application that's built on top of like a Claude, the very intelligent large language model, to do like really great summarizations and like really cool types of document searches. And he's posted all these articles about it. So that's like a great like window into that world.
One of the benefits of the eDiscovery vendors is obviously they can ingest documents and you get really good, clean data you can ask questions of, you can find things, but generally it's expensive. One of the benefits of Take the Chatbots is you can dump in any document you want and ask a question of it. And so I'm curious your thoughts on whether these eDiscovery vendors really have an existential crisis ahead of them or if they can play in the space in a coexisting manner.
I think that they actually marry really well for a number of reasons. So the competency that e-discovery companies have in sort of ingesting and understanding and tagging data using traditional NLP methods, it marries really powerfully with technologies like large language models, primarily because like traditional NLP techniques, things like traditional keyword search algorithms like BM25 are really performant for applications where domain expertise and domain specific terminology is common. So whether it's understanding legalese or a specific industry for a particular, let's say it's a manufacturing dispute, there's lots of complex words that are related to pharmaceuticals or something. Traditional keyword based search technology actually will outperform large language models today because large language models have ingested so much language, they kind of revert to the mean on sort of topics and words and names and meanings of things. So the fact that e-discovery companies have been working in document automation, document understanding previous to large language models, and they can marry that with modern techniques means they can build an application stack that is the best of both worlds. If you need to filter by one and then refine by another, they have the existing technology to do those kinds of steps. So I think it's actually an opportunity to build these specific kinds of solutions that understand vast amounts of data. I think one of the limitations is probably that eDiscovery has been really great because litigation is super expensive. So there's all this margin in there to play in, right? Where they can build the really great technology and save the company a ton of money and still sell it at a really high price. And whether or not that provides a solution more broadly, whether or not that goes into sort of all of enterprise document management or what who comes after who with the introduction of LLMs, I don't exactly understand how that dynamic is going to work out, but part of the specialized nature of eDiscovery being a litigation service has certainly been beneficial to it up to this point.
I don't know who's going to win in this whole thing, right? I get people asking me all the time, my friends, right? I have an opportunity to invest in the next round of blah, you know,
Mm-hmm.
lab or tech startup or whatever it might be. And I always just tell them, look, I mean, it's such like early days. I don't really know. I think it was actually on the Scott Galloway podcast. Somebody talked about this idea of airlines, like how they're just a horrible business, but it's beneficial to the economy. And I love that analogy because we might be in this world where these platforms are phenomenal and they're great from a productivity and efficiency standpoint, but to build them and do them is a bad business, and all the applications on top of them are great businesses. I don't know what that's going to look like. I think one question I have for you as somebody in the space, and I like to ask anybody that's doing this right now, is do you have any bold predictions of where you think this will go in the next year, 18 months?
Year to 18 months. Well, so I think what you're referring to is sort of the business of large language model building. Is that what you're referring to as being kind of a terrible industry similar to airlines?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm trying to think through. So, like, airlines are just a super interesting industry from the perspective of like the Porter's five forces analysis, right? When you look at how much pressure airlines put on top of like airline makers, but then how like airlines themselves have kind of turned into these businesses that sort of they arbitrage fuel and have become banks for like rewards points, in which there was this hilarious statistic from a few years ago, actually, where the market cap of Southwest Airlines was like 1/10 the sort of market rate value of their points reward system, right? Because the way that their points work is it's kind of like they're minting money like a bank. When you do a transaction with your credit card, they mint these points, which don't have any value until they're cashed in for something. And we're getting way off topic here, but the point is basically like the aggregate value of all these points is many, many times, the $10 billion that Southwest Airlines is worth. And so if there was ever this run on the bank, it would be kind of disastrous, but that's not how people spend airline points. So it kind of works out. It's just this weird dynamic of that industry. It doesn't really relate to model builders in any way, but I think it's correct that the continuing trend is that sort of like the large language model builders themselves, the OpenAIs, the Anthropics, Geminis, they're going to become heavily, heavily commoditized in terms of the models themselves. Like everyone sort of can reach model parity or like be 6 months behind or something like that. It's very, very hard to identify a large enough gap in performance of a new model in a timeline where it fits into your build cycle and you can like release a product that benefits from that in a time frame before someone else just comes out with a model that's just as good and half the price. So it's this sort of weird endless cycle, which again is great for application builders and looks really dismal for the model builders. Like I don't know how they make out in this scenario. So if I'm going to make a bold prediction, or this is actually not even a very bold prediction, just I'll say it's a pretty tame prediction, is that we will continue to see in performance, like performance per price will continue on. If it continues on its trajectory, then we can imagine a world where GPT-4o powered model right now, which is something like $5 per million tokens, let's say that becomes 10 times cheaper in a year's time. It really like makes a lot more types of applications possible now. We see a lot of innovation in the legal space right now because the margin, like legal is an industry, it's probably the highest margin text processing industry in the history of mankind. We take a bunch of documents, we add a ton of thoughtful intelligence, and then we charge $800 an hour for it for first year associates. that is an incredible margin, right? So there's all this margin to play in. So large language models are perfect fit for trying to automate some of that work and make some money in that space. But when you get 10 times cheaper or 100 times cheaper, now we can start looking at a whole bunch of other applications that were might not have been economically feasible to begin with, but now look much more promising. If we look back in time to like when GPT-4 was first released, so I said, GPT-4o is about it's like $5 per million tokens. Well, previously it was like $30 per million tokens. And at that point, you have to start considering like what is the equivalent cost value analysis of human labor versus GPT-4. And there were many applications where if you are sourcing labor from all around the world, you can find knowledge work at a price that was comparable to like GPT-4. But now, GPT-4 is like 80% cheaper or something like that. I don't think it I think it's like the price efficiency far exceeds human effort. And if we have a tenfold decrease in price again, like now we're looking at a world where we can just start analyzing all kinds of things using large language models, where before it just would have been economically unfeasible to do so.
100% agree with you. And I think that is part of whether you want to call it that airline idea, but I don't know how the model builders in the long term make money simply by providing access to the model, right? Because the cost structure is just, I can't figure it out. But somebody, hopefully smarter than me, is thinking about it. I do think that what you're starting to see is if you are a first layer wrapper on a large language model, which I don't belittle at all. I think that's fantastic. You're solving a problem, great work. But it's very easy for a model builder to take that application and layer it into their service, and you're sort of eliminated. And that's kind of where you're seeing this meld of business models, which is, yes, they're providing the large language model, but they're also starting to be, you know, a chat interface or a coding interface or a whatever it might be interface. And so that goes back to the domain expertise. Is what I always tell people is I think the more you can layer in and augment the models with expertise with something very specific on an application, whatever it might be, the more defensible your kind of moat might be. And in legal specifically, the more you can layer on very niche experience into what you're using, I think you're better off. Instead of being application for everything, you focus on, I just do this law, because it's very unlikely that one of the big model players or Microsoft or whomever is going to try to play in every space. They want to try to play in large spaces. The other question I have for you then is based on this idea of commoditization and that the models can mostly find parity over time. You have spent a lot of time benchmarking models. Do you think that's important for an organization to evaluate what each model does at any given time? Or because they're all basically in parity, you can kind of just pick one?
I actually think of evaluations as almost being like the actual, like one of the most attainable moats for application builders. Because, like you said, if you build out like a particular use case and it seems really valuable, like OpenAI can just copy it. It's like, well, that kind of depends because it may not be hard to make something that resembles another product. Like prototyping is super fast in the world of large language models, but knowing that it works reliably is actually much harder because that requires evaluation. So oftentimes, like especially at like this, one of my lessons from back at Lex Machina was that we wrote all these taggers and tagging case taggers and classifiers, and the value was in both the fact that we had labeled all this data, but that we knew how precise it was. We knew how well it performed, and that meant that it was defensible, and we could demonstrate our methodologies and show our customers why it was correct. And so, for me, that's almost the entire value of it. Anyone can now download 10,000 cases, run it through a large language model, and say, "Here's the contract ones. I've labeled them." But you really need a pretty good level of domain expertise to say this is why it's reliable, this is why it's defensible. So, I think evaluations are actually key to understanding like how well these things perform because they always give answers regardless of whether or not they're accurate. That said, I think there are lots of types of applications where I feel like product builders need to be sensitive to what the model build. So the model builders are going to go after certain types of applications in order to make some money. Like they have to be able to build they have to build something that's more useful in order to monetize, I believe. And they're doing this, right? When you look at all the different additions that Anthropic and ChatGPT are adding to their platforms, like they're building applications. So, like, developers need to be sensitive to what the model builders are doing to monetize. But at the same time, there are so many domain specific applications that I don't see a way that OpenAI could, for instance, go after all of them. And so, an example of this would be the fact that OpenAI created this like a RAG endpoint a long time ago where you upload data, a document, they automatically parse it, they automatically chunk it, they vectorize it, and then you can do RAG searches against it to do retrieval augmented searches. So you upload 50 documents, and you can ask questions, it'll retrieve the best answers, the best relevant text segments from each of those 50 documents and give you an answer. And at the time there was this proclamation like, oh, all of the RAG search engine startups are dead, just 100 startups just fizzled out with this announcement. Well, as it turns out, like, OpenAI, I'm sure it's their implementation, I'm sure it's technically very competent. It's not tuned for any specific use case, so it's actually not hard to find a lot of different vendors who will offer you sort of the same description product on the outside of the can, but their RAG applications are specially tuned or more refined, and they vastly outperform OpenAI's sort of middle of the road approach. So this is both promising for application developers, but I think probably causes a lot of challenges for differentiation because, as you alluded to earlier, when you were talking about investment opportunities, there are so many of these startups that look almost exactly the same. They all kind of just look like they're doing the exact same thing. And when you try to figure out what is Leia doing that's really different from, like, the next thing that organizes data and answers questions, like how is it different from Hebia and all these different platforms? And the reality is that they're all doing different things really well, but figuring out what those are from, quickly as a consumer, I think is still pretty challenging. So the industry is sort of moving so fast and it's so new that we almost like lack the language to talk about why these products are actually vastly different. But if you describe them at the right level of generality, it's almost hard to tell them apart. And we still need to be working on the education and language to consumers to explain to them what each of these platforms is good for and why they're different and how they're better than ChatGPT Pro, for instance.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I mean, and everything's kind of moving so fast, it's hard to even keep track. I mean, Leia, I think, announced today that they changed their name. So it's not even Leia
Oh,
anymore. It's like Gano or something. I mean, again, it's just like, I'm sure they had a reason for it. It's a great product, all those kinds of things. But as an end consumer and customer, it's really difficult. And I saw it as a consultant in the legal space in kind of every piece of software that a law firm or a legal department might want. Right? Classic one was, contract legal management platforms are the thing right now because it's clear business use case, saving or finding money, all those kinds of things. But there are 1,000 of them, and lawyers aren't very good at making a decision as to, I mean, anybody really, of why that software is better than that software. And I think we're in now just a new universe of more tools. And what are we calling things? I mean, I was talking to a general counsel who's, oh, well, I'm considering Spot Draft and I'm considering Ironclad. And I'm like, whoa, those are very different. What are you trying to do? He's like, oh, what do you mean? They're both CLMs. And I'm like, no. Okay. So, right. And it's that answer. I think we've also touched off a universe in all software really, and definitely in legal, where now with these language models and application layers, if you're the end user, you can also probably start creating things on your own that before you required a developer, a piece of software, something else, right? And so the explosion of tools and things you have to evaluate is very difficult. And actually, that's why going back to benchmarking, I think is like very important. If we can find tools out there, and again, whether it's the Hugging Face leaderboard or whatever it might be, which have their own problems, but that's beside the point, is having something that you can point back to. I think is an interesting product business in and of itself right now. If you can become the expert or the go-to resource, and I don't mean like Forrester and their quadrant of magic necessarily, but something like that where you don't necessarily pay you for that action, but that's again is I think important. And so people like you that are doing this work of like how you might evaluate these tools, actually I think is very important. Okay, I have another kind of tangential question for you as we've now spent a while talking. that I think you might have a unique perspective on based on your language background, in your data science and technical background is, there's this talk these days a little bit of maybe language is intelligence. Maybe that is the connection point. And while we don't understand it, that's actually what our brain is doing, right? Like figured out language and those electrical connections do everything else. And so when we built these AI platforms, these models that we thought were just probabilistic token predictors, actually that's intelligence, right? And as they get more and more information and they develop more and more, we're in this new world. And again, this is whether you want to call it AGI or whatever world. And I'm just curious of your thoughts on that.
From a development perspective, like I think the most useful way to think about large language models is not as intelligent, but having predictable behaviors. So like, steerable outcomes where we can build a system that will be accurate 97% of the time and maybe useful like 90% of the time. So those are sort of different metrics, right? Like accurate is it didn't say anything incorrectly, maybe we'll say, and then useful will be elicited something that can be used by the end user. So we might come up with some metrics like that where we can predict how well it will perform, and then based upon those criteria decide whether or not this is producing useful, productionizable outcomes. And when that happens, like the model is exhibiting, like it is mimicking intelligence, displaying intelligence, and whether or not it inherently is intelligent or not is sort of like, I think, somewhat immaterial. But at the same time, I think there are these really interesting aspects of the way like large language models and like their weird latent space vector understanding of reality is sort of a reflection of human. It sort of gives us another model of cognition that we can sort of analogize to our own brains in a way. So sort of sidestepping the question of whether or not they actually are intelligent, it's like they certainly mimic intelligence, and they kind of give us this sort of looking glass mirror reflection of how we think about our own brains. Like when OpenAI made Sora available for like ChatGPT Plus users, where you can go to Sora.com and just put in some words and it creates like a video clip, and they're nonsensical and they're weird, and like there's sort of no object permanence. Like the camera will like tilt and it's completely different. People like fold in and out of existence. They sprout legs and arms from different parts of their bodies, and it's not realistic, but it's extremely dreamlike. It feels surreal. It feels like something you'd see in your dreams. And so it made me think, like I was just sort of entranced by them. I was like, just would watch like these little 5-10 second videos of just all this random stuff happening, because it felt so much like my dreams. Like I recognized something in it, even though it's completely just computational, video garbage. Like this stuff is at this point almost useless, except that it's just really strangely compelling for some reason. So I think that what I see right now is like a reflection of intelligence, but perhaps not intelligence itself, if that addresses your question.
It does. And I just think it's an interesting thing as we learn more and the technology progresses, that we might have stumbled on a better understanding of our own selves that we weren't even looking for necessarily, right? I don't know what that means for the world. It's very like kind of a meta existential thought, but I think it's important for us as inquisitive people to consider what is out there and just think beyond the thing in front of us.
Yeah. Well, one certainly interesting aspect that sort of relates back to this sort of reflection of this concept of whether or not models are intelligent is considering the multimodal models. So models that can input sound and images, and sometimes a sequence of images to constitute video, as well as language. And there is sort of this shared token space where the sound is converted in tokens, the words are converted into tokens, and so everything is sort of converted into these subunits of semantic language. Well, originally I thought it was language, but now it's like it's just these semantic tokens, right? Little components of thought. And so there's sort of this the model contains this common a commonality that allows it to go from a sound to a word to an image and back again at the same time. It's very interesting because it makes one think like, is there a type of thinking that is not based in language? Like, are all of your thoughts in words or not? Right. And so is this model that is thinking in image components, it's thinking in sounds, it's thinking in words, like how close to intelligence does that get us? I don't really know.
You bring up an interesting point that I hadn't really thought of because there are people who, as the world goes, sort of narrate everything in their brain. And then there are people like me who I always joke, my wife always asks me, like, what's going on in your brain? I'm like, nothing. There's literally nothing in there. It's just a black box. She's like, well, how do you talk and think? I'm like, I don't know. It just comes out. That is an interesting concept of what is going on. Is it the actual language thinking or is it thought through some other mechanism? I don't have an answer for that, but very intriguing. One last question before we close out. You have to tell me about knives. So, why did you get into knives? How do you get into knives? I mean, do you have like a whole collection? Is this chef knives? Is this samurai knives? Like, what is this?
It's mostly pocket knives. Well, what's interesting, I mean, knives are one of the sort of primordial tools that, humans invented. We invented like rock and stick, then sharpened stick, and eventually we got to like some kind of cutting implement, which originally was probably like a sharpened stone or a flint or, it's really primordial, one of the, first tools humans invented. And I've sort of been intrigued by them and just really enjoyed things like cooking and carving paper sculptures, which is a form of Japanese cardstock carving when I was in middle school. And so I've always sort of enjoyed like sharp objects for their craft potential. And then when sort of some point during the pandemic, when we were all just like sitting at home collecting things, right? Like, or that's what I started doing, just sitting at home and collecting things. One of them was pocket knives. And so there was lots of interesting pocket knives and their different manufacturers and different construction techniques, which relate to either stylistic choices or practical elements. A lot of them are not very practical. So they're pretty much just pocket jewelry pieces that high performance pocket jewelry, kind of like really expensive watches. A watch that works way better than it ever needs to, but people just enjoy the craftsmanship and that goes into it. Because I'm sort of a nerd, it sort of bleeded over it. For some people, and people enjoy different things in knives. Some people really get into like the metallurgy aspect of it, which is there's this interesting technology called powder metallurgy, which was invented somewhere around the 70s or so, but it allows you to create what are called high alloy steels. So it's a technology that allows you to build new types of steel with properties that you simply could not put into the same piece of metal before because of the way they heat and crystallize. Like the materials would separate out. So from the 70s, they had to invent this new way of making steel, which now allows you to make these really exotic forms of steel with really cool properties of like edge retention, and they're non-corrosive and they perform in really special ways. And they're primarily used for things like tools and dies where you need extremely high performance metal. And then a tiny amount of it gets turned into pocket knives. And, I pay too much for them and buy a whole bunch of them.
I think that makes a lot of sense for your current profession because metallurgy, a lot of it is basically combining disparate parts with some art and some science into something. And that seems to be what you are doing these days. And that makes a lot of sense to me. And I'm glad you found both a hobby and a profession that you love. As we close out for today, I always like to ask, is there anything you would like our audience to take away from today's conversation in their journey, their profession, their founding companies, whatever it might be?
I think if we're talking about the legal profession, because as you said, you like to tie everything back to law, it's that this is sort of a moment of where there's going to be a great level of efficiency change to the industry, but it's not something that the industry hasn't seen before. If we look back to the advent of legal research, cloud tools, these were both things that the legal industry eventually adopted that greatly changed the efficiency of the industries. Perhaps large language models is greater. Who knows? We get to see that. But in both and all these different technological shifts that the industry has previously seen didn't lead to either sort of a complete erode, like it didn't destroy demand for legal services, it didn't erode uh, the price of legal services. We found ways to sort of make up the difference, add more value back. And so I don't know that the outcome will be the same in this instance. But when you see a legal services tool that promises to do something 10 times faster at one fifth the price, I think the answer is now how do we serve clients better? Like, how do we add the value back? Because there's always something else you could have done that you weren't doing because that previous task took so long. I don't think it's all doom and gloom and that we're all going to be out of jobs.
I happen to agree with you. And I think the nugget I took out of that is stay hopeful, stay positive, and continue providing value in whatever you're doing. And things generally work themselves out, right? So thank you so much for being on Do More, Be Better, Leonard. And we can't wait to have you on again.
Sounds great.